You're watching Reality Check. The curve of the COVID virus for now may be on the decline in India, but the question of how many Indians died during the pandemic remains hotly contested. The official death count is around 4 lakhs currently, but the work of journalists, media organizations including NDTV as well as researchers have repeatedly raised questions over the undercounting of deaths, using data from cremation grounds as well as death registration data to point out the gap between the official COVID death statistics and the so-called excess unexplained deaths. Now a new study by a group of scholars, including former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian, has used multiple parameters to estimate that India's excess deaths during the pandemic year could be anywhere between 35 to 40 lakh deaths, a number almost 10 times higher than the official death count, which, as I said, is somewhere in the range of 4 lakhs. Joining me on the show tonight is Arvind Subramanian, who joins us, I believe, from Boston, if I'm not mistaken. Arvind Subramanian, good to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for.
So, let's just, and we'll try and keep this as simple as possible and not get too technical so that the ordinary viewer is able to understand how all of this is being estimated. But that's a huge number, Arvind Subramanian, anywhere between 35 to 40 lakh, I guess in a sense, excess or unexplained deaths during this pandemic period. As I said, almost 10 times more than the official count. Explain those numbers to us and how you arrived at them.
Yeah. First of all, I think, Vasu, we need to be very clear that, we're probably not going to really ever have completely satisfactory answers to this question, because it's in the nature of the beast that it's such a difficult thing to measure, especially since, health information systems in India are still not, as good as they ought to be. So that is why what we did in this study, it's very important to emphasize, is that we looked at it from 3 different data sources using different methodologies, because no one source is going to be completely reliable, no one methodology is going to be accurate. And each of these has shortcomings. So what we do in this paper is to say, look, 3 different ways, lots of problems with each of them, but this is the best we have, and let's see what they show up. So very important. And essentially what you find is that there's a range between, as you said, 35 to 40 lakhs or 35 to 45 lakhs. That's our best guess of the range. And it could be a little less, it could be a little bit more, because there's a lot of uncertainty around each of these. Now, coming to your question of, it sounds like a lot, right? And I think we have to be a little bit careful here. It sounds like a lot relative to the official count, right? As you said, it could be 7 to 10 times more than this. But I think the other appropriate way of looking at it in terms of a comparison is vis-a-vis other countries. I mean, if you have 1.38 billion, obviously you'll have more cases and more deaths.
Sure.
So that's not the appropriate benchmark. What you find are central estimates is exactly what you would expect in a country of the size of India, and given infection rates, we saw the latest seroprevalence study, it's 70% infection. So with such high seroprevalence, such a high population, this is what we expect to find. Now, so in some ways, also the problem was that at the end of the first wave, we as a nation and society thought we had somehow escaped the worst, and that we were outliers in a kind of positive direction, i.e., we escaped the worst. What this is saying is that no, we're not very unusual or not unusually bad. We're just somewhere in the middle of the pack, given infection rates and so on.
Okay, so in a way, what you're saying is, and just to summarize also for our viewers, that as you said, you looked at different points or different data points or different sources of how to calculate this. You looked at death registry data, you looked at household surveys, and also, as you mentioned, you looked at international fatality rates for the virus and compared that to what was going on in India, and then you made some of these projections. And as you said, we weren't that different from other countries, even though the official death rate or the fatality rate might be lower. A more realistic projection would put us at a higher number. I'm not sure if you're aware, or you might already be aware, Mr. Subramanian, that the government has already started to push back at some of this. Statement was issued yesterday by the Health Ministry. One of the things they've challenged is this assumption that, as they say, that in these reports quoting findings from some recent studies, US and European countries' age-specific infection fatality rates have been used to calculate excess deaths in India. The extrapolation of deaths has been done on an audacious assumption that the likelihood of any given infected person dying is the same across country, dismissing the interplay between various sort of specific factors.
Yeah, firstly, we say in the paper, that's why we want to look at three different sources, not one.
Right.
And here, because you can't measure deaths in India reasonably, right? But infection rates are better measured from all the seroprevalence survey.
Right.
So to get at this, you need to have some measure of what we call the infection fatality rate, right?
Okay.
Now, there are many ways of, there are many estimates out there. So what we took was what is considered the best international estimate, which is put out by the CDC for age. Now, what I want to emphasize here, the only assumption we've made is that the age-specific number comes from international experience. Remember, could be less in India, it could be more in India because Indian health systems are more challenged. Therefore, the chance of dying if you're infected may be actually greater in India. So we don't know which. But it's important to remember that we still use Indian demography. The fact that India is a young population is reflected. The fact that infection rates have been somewhat higher for higher age groups is reflected in that.
Okay.
So the only assumption is, for any given person infected, would he be more or less in India compared to some international norm?
Okay. All right. Understood. But just again, one thing to understand, that when you say that there are these huge numbers of excess deaths, as you put it, a range of anywhere between 35 to almost 50 lakh deaths, this is not to say that these might necessarily be COVID deaths, right? There's a kind of question mark over what the cause of them could be, but it's not clear that they're COVID. Or is that?
Vasu, to make it very clear that these are what are called all-cause excess deaths, because you cannot attribute things to the disease, especially in a country like India, where how you record deaths is going to be kind of very tricky, depending on protocols, etc. So very careful to say these are all-cause deaths, which has become somewhat the standard way of measuring deaths during the pandemic all over the world. But it's very clear, it is all-cause, because you say in the COVID period so many deaths happened, in a baseline so many deaths happened.
Right.
What's the difference? What's the difference? You're not saying how many more COVID deaths, etc. So I think that one has to be very careful about. But this is kind of the standard way of measuring broadly a sense of what happened during the pandemic.
Sure. But with that caveat, Arvind Subramanian, I think the sort of assumption here is that if there's such a huge gap between a normal year or a non-COVID year and a COVID year, it does point to the fact that there may have been a pretty significant undercounting of COVID deaths.
The fact that there's been significant undercounting, I think nobody would dispute at all. I think that's not an issue. The only question is how much is the undercounting, and that's what we're all trying to grapple with. I also want to emphasize, Vasu, that remember this is, don't want to pretend that this is the final word on the subject.
Right.
That there are studies coming out, and I've seen some of them that broadly point to similar ballpark estimates. But I would very much urge others to continue this work. More sources of data are becoming available, and this is the way see, the broader point here is that in order to respond to a pandemic like this, we need the best possible data, people, the scientific community working on the data, both government and society as a whole, so that we can mount the best response both in advance and in response to once the pandemic is it. So that's the spirit in which we must, I think, look at all these studies. It's an effort at arriving at, a better sense of what happened, and so that as a nation and society, we use science and data to more effectively fight, what are, amazing, pretty huge human catastrophe, right? And we want the best possible response to this.
No, of course. That may well be the purpose of these numbers, but as you know, that's not often how governments receive it. And the government has, as I said, not just on this occasion, but earlier also said that, look, there's no question of fudging any death data. We're not hiding any data. The statement that they put out in response, I suspect largely to your study, is again repeating that. And it's saying that we have a robust system of recording COVID-19 deaths, and these sorts of projections are fallacious and misleading.
But here's just a very important point to emphasize as well, that nowhere in the study, and none of us can say that the government is deliberately undercounting or fudging the data. No, we have no evidence to say that or believe that at all. The fact of the undercount is clear. The reasons for it, we say nothing on it, and we don't really know. And really, a lot of it could just be due to, the way we measure this. For example, the civil registration systems is done by the states, right? Now, we know historically they massively undercount, but that's been improving over time. So we have traditional weaknesses in our capacity to do this. The central government has this SRS where they do annual surveys. That's, lagging behind. Last 2-3 years, it hasn't been done. So I don't think anyone should say there's intent behind the undercounting. We don't know. It's just that, our systems are not as good as they should be, and we need to improve those. Okay. So there's no insinuation at all in our paper at all that this is intentional or whatever.
Okay, so so accepting that argument of yours, that it's done more just as a way of trying to sort of build awareness, but a counter view could be, Arvind Subramanian, that as you say, that if these estimates themselves are in a sense still to be sort of rigorously tested, as you said, the sources of the data itself is not 100% clear, the numbers could all change. Some would ask then, is it even wise to do these estimates? Because when the numbers come out, and as they did in this case with this huge headline figure, it does create this kind of sensation and perception of deaths being hidden. So how would you respond to that? That is it even worth undertaking exercises of this kind?
Vasu, two responses. Science and statistics were always going to be working in a world of uncertainty. If you say you can only produce estimates, when there's perfect certainty, you won't progress with your advancement of anything. So you have to, so you can't say, I stopped studying this unless we have a perfect world. We're never going to have that perfect world, and that's why you have to be as careful as possible and make clear what assumptions you make, because we all need to know what is the right scale of the catastrophes of the human tragedy. It's so important, just from the point of people coming to grips with closure. For so many people it's closure, and for others it's a sense of we need to understand the scale in order to draw the right lessons and to be able to respond in the future. So there's both a kind of intrinsic reason to understand this and a kind of instrumental reason to get a better sense of reality. We have to do, and this is how kind of studies and science progresses from.
Okay, let's try to drill a little deeper into your study itself, because as I mentioned, we were amongst many media outlets looking at death registration data from different states, comparing a normal year to the pandemic year and trying to find the gap. We were successful in some states, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, we got data for Bihar and so on, but there were several states which are quote unquote still dark when it comes to that. What did you find? I mean, especially Uttar Pradesh, which has been a big state as far as the perception of a lot of uncounted deaths. We couldn't really get very credible data. What did you find when you went into it at a more sort of state specific level?
Yeah. So firstly, as you said, a lot of this work has been possible because of the amazing, fearless reporting by many journalists, both in the Indian press and in the vernacular press. So this is just an amazing tribute to all of them in India. So essentially, what we did was that this the counting of the CRS deaths is available for 7 states with kind of good data and more cities as well. So we looked at the numbers for the states for which the data were available. We also looked at historically what was the undercounting pattern in these states. And then we said, made various assumptions about, and these 7 states, by the way, account for about 50% of India's population because they include UP. And then you say, well, you have to make assumptions. If what's true for the 7 states applies to India as a whole, you get one number. What if you change those assumptions? For example, if you include UP, the India number looks better. If you exclude UP, the overall India number looks worse, because especially in the second wave, the UP data looks kind of implausibly low, and that needs to be fixed. The other thing, Vasud, remember, is that these CRS numbers, for many of the states, even for which we have the data, for most states, it's still only available till May. So the kind of the June data are still not in yet. So that's the sense in which, this is all, has to be done on an ongoing basis and digging deeper, and this should be an ongoing process. Right. But that's where we, in terms of the CRS data.
Right. CRS, again, just to tell our viewers, is the central registry system for data. So as you mentioned, these 7 states.
No, Vasud, sorry, not central. It's the civil registration system done by the states.
Yes,
it's not the center. I just want to clarify.
Yes, I'm glad you corrected me. You're right. The civil registration system, which is done statewide. So as you mentioned, yes, there are 7 states. We also were largely getting info from those states. But as you said, UP, that's one area which, if you could just talk about that a little more, because as you rightly pointed out, the numbers do seem very, very low.
Actually, in UP, the pattern is interesting, Vasu. In the first wave, according to by the way, also, we talk about first wave and second wave. And one of the things I want to kind of point out about the study is that one of the most surprising findings we have is that the first wave, I think, was a bit more serious than all of us maybe believed in real time. And it's possible that that's what led to some of maybe the complacency at the end of the first wave, the sense that we have somehow escaped it. But coming back to UP, what is interesting about the UP CRS data is that it seems to suggest that the first wave was somewhat better recorded than the second wave. It's the second wave numbers in UP that seem, extremely low. And that's why we had to say, look, a full disclosure, if you put UP in, you get this number. If you take UP out, you get a different higher number. And of course, in fact, in UP, as you know, I think Saurav Das had this, extracted this information based on RTI for about 24 out of 75 districts. And he found, of course, finally, some of it didn't tally with what the state government was reporting to the central government. But even so, based on those 1/3 of the districts that he did, the numbers were very high. Of course, all these need to be validated, and that's why this is going to be an ongoing process.
But you think, Arvind Subramanian, that despite the fact that you have done this exercise, as you said, many others have come out with these numbers, do you believe that there will be a serious attempt by the government to try to sort of dig into this and try and sort of come up with a more realistic assessment of these deaths? Because, as I said, all the responses seem to be very much with this quote-unquote political way of looking at it, that this is kind of being done to, discredit us and to make India's story look worse. And so sort of the response seems to be right now just to reject and rebut.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the government's intentions are, but I very much hope that, because there is finally no substitute, Vasu, for good government data based on surveys, the SRS, which is the government's way of doing it every year. I mean, that needs to be done quickly and carefully. There's no substitute for that. Now, whether the government will do that or not, I don't know. But I would very much urge that, if the government wants to kind of, provide a different and a better picture, then it would have to, carry on, do the surveys, and then give us maybe the final definitive picture. But I think there has to be a kind of willingness and openness to, say, we want to find out what the exact numbers are, because, this is not about, because I think it's important to make the point, Vasu, here is that, look, in this pandemic, no government, no society has come out looking, very good. Right. Every government, and almost every government and every society has made mistakes, So in that sense, it's not a question of, finger pointing or whatever, because, the pandemic has been a global thing. Sure. You take advanced economies, US, UK, Germany, France, China, which originated it all, they've all made serious mistakes. And therefore it's in the nature of this that, we will make some mistakes, and therefore, we should learn from them to see how we can do better next time around.
True. But as we're seeing, even with this whole recent spat over the oxygen deaths or deaths related to oxygen shortages, as you may have seen, essentially the government was asked and they said, listen, there were no deaths because of oxygen shortage. Reason being, no states were reporting those deaths, which again points to how these deaths were being counted.
Yeah, I think that is, I think things should be different. To say that, there were no oxygen-related deaths, kind of just defies any sense of what happened, right? So I'm very much hoping that, the other thing I would say, Vasu, in this is that I think not just the central government, but maybe the state governments also should undertake, much more careful surveys of what happened in this. And, because we need it from multiple sources. If any one source is going to be a bit difficult providing this, we need multiple sources. And that's why, researchers around the world are actually grappling with the same issue. And that's why all of us need to be, working on this.
Right. I just want to ask you in conclusion on a slightly different note that was this this is a kind of slightly uncharted area for you to move from crunching sort of economic data to wade into, this area of kind of epidemiological almost analysis. Was that something that was that challenging or what?
No, I mean,
or data is data in a way. So.
Exactly. This is completely, a lot of this work has been done by economists along with, and we've of course consulted, we presented this and we've consulted, and therefore it's mostly a kind of a hardcore data issue,
sure.
With of course with some sense of, to understand some of the basics of health and things. So, if you're suggesting that I shouldn't be doing this, Vasu, then I will take.
I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was just wondering how you felt wading into what might be uncharted waters. But no, wasn't. Of course, I wasn't suggesting that. And you're quite right to say that it's been done as a kind of collaborative effort in a lot of cases. So.
Yeah, and I hope more and more people will do this.
Indeed. Arvind Subramanian, it was great to have you. Must have you back to talk about the economy as well very soon, because that's also, and as always, an emerging and unfolding area of concern. But thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.